So, after I posted my Barris and the Bold history, someone asked in comments for a discussion of Aerys' seven, his white swords, his Kingsguard, at the end of his reign. And I said, why not? The show has pretty much abandoned all that entirely, so it's up to the readers of the novels to kind of think about this. Now, the Kingsguard as an institution, I don't think the show really gets across the fact of how important it had once been in sort of the culture of the Seven Kingdoms. They were supposed to be the epitome of chivalry. They were supposed to be the exemplars of honor and faithful obedience and courage in the Seven Kingdoms. They were what boys were supposed to aspire to. They were, as Ned Stark, who, he follows the old gods. He doesn't follow the Seven. He's not a knight. But he said, to Bran in a conversation they had before, when he was still in Winterfell, that the Kingsguard were a shining example to the world. I think that's very telling. Now, this does not mean they were perfect. This does not mean that they were unrealistically... Obviously, society has built this image of them, and it's sort of... It keeps that image, even if the actual men, because they are men at the end, are imperfect, who sort of are not, living up to that standard. Even the Kingsguard can fail to live up to that standard, but that standard remains. So there have been infamous Kingsguard. There have been terrible Kingsguard. Kristen Cole, the Kingmaker, who convinced Aegon II to claim the crown that a lot of people thought was his sister's. And that led to a 2-year-long civil war, probably the most brutal civil war that Westeros ever saw. Even, barring Robert's Rebellion, which lasted just a year, and it actually ended fairly cleanly compared to how the Dance of Dragons, as it was called, ended. But there have been many famous Kingsguard, and Aerys' Seven seem to have been a pretty good example of what a really exemplary Kingsguard was supposed to be. Now, obviously Aerys' reign was not just a year long. He reigned for a number of years, and he had a number of Kingsguard over that time. We hear of 2 others that aren't there at the end. One of them is Sir Gawain Gaunt. He is a Kingsguard who's killed when Lord Darkland seizes Aerys as part of a defiance of Duskendale to try and force the crown to give his town a charter and more rights. And this Gawain Gaunt is avenged. His killer is killed in turn by his sworn brother, Barris and Selmy, when he breaks out Aerys. So, and then there's the other one. This one is like pretty much the next to last member of the company, which is Harlan Grandison, old Harlan Grandison, whose family's arms are a sleeping lion. Well, he died in his sleep, which seems appropriate enough. Now, it's his death that gives the opening for Jaime to join the Kingsguard. And I don't know if the show will ever discuss this. Perhaps it will, but I'll explain that. At 15, Jaime is knighted. He's knighted by Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, who is considered the deadliest of a Kingsguard. Who, when George was asked, if you had Barris and Selmy and Arthur Dayne at their primes fighting, who would win? And George said, well, with normal weapons, it'd be a toss-up, 50-50. They were both the greatest swordsmen of their time. And if Dayne has Dawn, the legendary sword of House Dayne, well, it's Dayne. He basically had no question about it. It's sort of like a Valyrian steel sword, but not, and I'll discuss that a bit more later. So, that's a huge honor. It's a fantastic honor. I mean, Jaime was serving Lord Craighall, but Sir Arthur Dayne who knights him for his deeds when they were fighting the Kingswood Brotherhood, this infamous band. And Jaime wanted to be, basically, he wanted to be the Sword of the Morning. He wanted to be like the Sword of the Morning. So it was a huge honor for him. And he goes to King's Landing, and his sister is there. Tywin is still hand. Tywin must be a very proud father, hugely proud of his son, winning his knighthood so early and from the greatest knight in the realm. And Cersei is there, and she is very proud of her brother, which means she dresses up as a peasant girl and sneaks out of a castle to meet him in some secret place and have a tryst. Their incest goes back years, really. They're 15 at this time, but it was something they did years back. And she convinces him, Tywin wants him to stay at Casterly Rock and learn the duties of the future Lord of Casterly Rock. And there's whispers that he's talking to Lord Tully about wanting to marry Jaime to Lysa Tully. And Cersei's hit on a plan. She says, you could join the Kingsguard. Old Grandison is dead. Aerys is looking for a replacement. You could do that. And she's very convincing in bed. So apparently she whispers in the right ears and puts the idea in Aerys' head. Aerys, who's paranoid about Tywin, who I think has probably already had Ilan Payne's tongue torn out for having once boasted, Ilan Payne was captain of a guard for Tywin when he was Hand of the King, boasted that, Tywin was the one who really ruled the realm. So this is to him perfect. He can take away Tywin's heir and humble him. So Jaime is called to join the Kingsguard. His father is furious, resigns his hand, takes off. Jaime goes though, because the sad thing is he's kind of trapped now. He has to join the Kingsguard, while Tywin, in leaving as Hand and departing from King's Landing, takes Cersei with him. So that means that they can't be together as she planned. And yes, you may be thinking, wait a second. Even if the plan had worked, the idea was that he was going to become a Kingsguard and immediately be breaking his vows of celibacy with his sister. But the whole plan was just to keep them together and keep the relationship. Yeah, there's problems with Jaime's grasp on right and wrong sometimes. For him, he could be a Kingsguard and have all that glory and have all that honor and be part of his fantastic lineage and history, and at the same time he'd be breaking his vows. He's not the cleverest. So Tywin takes off, Cersei's gone, Jaime has to go to Harrenhal, and it's still the greatest moment of his life to be there to get the White Cloak. It hasn't really sunk in yet how much of a problem it's going to be for him, but just then it's the highlight of his life. The great tourney at Harrenhal, very important occasion. A lot happens there, George says. And then Aerys sort of shames him as soon as he's got his cloak. He doesn't let him ride in a tournament. He says, no, I don't need 7 Kingsguard here. You can go back to King's Landing and, guard the castle. So he does it. It kind of tasted a bit horrible, but so the 7 at this time. Who are the 6 who are there to greet their new brother? Well, the Lord Commander is Sir Gerald Hightower, who I believe is the uncle to the current Lord Hightower, perhaps great uncle. I'm blanking at the moment. He was called the White Bull. We really don't know much about his deeds or anything. We just know he was tremendously respected. And definitely he's an older fellow at this time. 50s, probably. And he is maybe even 60s actually. It's unclear. Now his view of the vows are very black and white. They swear to defend the king, to give their lives for his, to keep his secrets, to do what he says. And so, the Kingsguard are present when Aerys commits some of his atrocities, when he has Brandon Stark, cruelly strangled on this, strangulation device he imported from Tyrosh. And it's the cruelest possible thing. He put a sword just out of his reach, while his father was chained above his fire, and the pyromancers were roasting him alive. And he said, no, all you have to do is get the sword, cut yourself free, and you can save your father. But it's just out of reach, and Brandon essentially strangles himself, trying to get to it. And Rickard Stark dies a horrible death. His armor is turning cherry red. His screams horrible. And Jaime afterwards is very troubled by it, and Gerald Hightower can see it and takes him aside and tells him, ours is not to judge. We're here to defend and to do what he says. Don't judge. It's not your place. Later on we have it sounds like we have another member of the Kingsguard, Sir John Dory. He is actually a detail George has written in correspondence, but he hasn't actually stated in public, or rather written in the books, is that Jonathan Dory was the brother of Willem Dory, the Master at Arms at King's Landing. Willem Dory is, of course, the man who leads the group that escorts the Queen to Dragonstone with the young Viserys, and who, after the Queen dies, giving birth to Daenerys, and the garrison is about to turn on them, he's the one who spirits them out to Braavos. So you can see why the Dorys are very particularly loyal to the Iron Throne, because they were so tied to it. They had one member of the family was a Kingsguard, another one was a trusted member of the household. In any case, you have John Dory. There's an occasion where Aerys is essentially raping his wife, and Jaime and Dory are there outside the door, and they're hearing her cries as he's hurting her and forcing her. And Jaime finally asks, shouldn't we do something? We swore to protect them, the Targaryens, the royal family. And Jonathan Dory says, yes, but not from him. The Kingsguard at this time, at least as Dory and Hightower state, is that Aerys, there's just no questioning Aerys. He does what he does, and theirs is to protect him. I've always thought perhaps that some of them might have simplified this, because there's this 15-year-old brother of hers who's just too young who can't really understand perhaps the complexities. I'm pretty sure that Gerald Hightower was kind of dubious. No matter how skilled Jaime was, how bold and courageous, he was too young for that duty, some might think. Prince Lewin Martell, that's another one of the Kingsguard. He is the uncle to the current Prince of Dorne, who joined the Kingsguard. He's an interesting one, because he's one of the ones that we learn later on, or we're told later on. It may not be true. No way, it is true, because of course Varys and Selmy reflects on it later on. We learn that he had a paramour from before he joined the Kingsguard, who continued to have a relationship with after joining the Kingsguard. And it was kind of like an open secret among the other Kingsguard that he visited in his paramour. A paramour in Dorne it's a person you choose because you love them. You might marry somebody out of duty, but your paramour is a person that is your love match. It's a person you actually love. It's not just a casual mistress. It's not just a fling on the side. It is your wife in all but legality. So Lewin joined the Kingsguard, but just like Jaime wasn't necessarily intending to follow through on all the vows, and yet he's kind of very well regarded. Barristan cites him as one of the famous noble men he served by in his years in the Kingsguard. Let's see, that's Hightower and Dory. Oswald Went. Is it Oswald Went? I think it's Oswald Went. The Wents are a family that we haven't heard about. Well, sort of. In the first season of the show, when Catelyn is seizing Tyrion, and she asks one of the men, "Is that the Black Bat of Harrenhal?" I see. Well, the Black Bat is a symbol of House Went of Harrenhal. The Wents are a long line of unlucky houses that have received Harrenhal and seem to have been. There seems to be a curse. Every house that holds Harrenhal ends brutally or tragically or sadly. In the case of the Wents, the Wents were the ones who, about 15, 16, 17 years earlier, threw this great tournament at Harrenhal, the greatest tournament of that generation. Lord Went wanted to show off his wealth, and he wanted to show off his sons, and he held this huge tournament, all sorts of games. There was a 7-sided melee and axe throwing competitions, and of course there was a tournament in which this is one where George is borrowing a bit from something from history as well, but also Ivanhoe, where you have champions, and basically you name 7 champions or what have you, and then you have people challenge them in turn, and basically if you defeat the champion, you become a champion, and it goes on until everyone's jousted, and you have these last champions who fight among themselves, and then one of them is crowned the champion. We don't really know much about him, but I'll touch a bit more on him later because he's part of a very important event down the road. So that's now Hightower, and Martell, and Went, and Dory. Barristan we've already covered, I think. I don't need to cover him again, I think. That leaves us with, and Jaime I've touched on, and that leaves us with Sir Arthur Dayne. Now this one to me is my personal favorite of these legendary figures, because the other thing that Ned said to Bran when he was discussing the Kingsguard and how they were a shining example is, he tells him, the greatest knight I ever saw was Sir Arthur Dayne. And he fought with a sword made out of the heart of a falling star, and he would have killed me if it weren't for Howland Reed. Now, this is obviously, you readers know all about the Tower of Joy. This is an iconic moment from that first novel that's never going to show up, as far as I can tell, on a TV show. I can understand why. It makes me sad because it's such a beautiful moment. The war is done. Robert's won. Barristan Selmy, gravely wounded but will live. Jaime Lannister has killed Aerys. Jonathan Dory, Lewin Martell, and those two have died at the Trident. What we're told in particular about Lewin Martell is that he's leading 10,000 Dornish spears. That's part of the battle, one of the battles. Armies in this setting are divided into battles. You have a left battle and a right battle. He was commanding one of them. When a young knight named Sir Lyn Corbray, hot-headed but quite skilled, he actually won his spurs fighting against Robert at Goldtown, when Goldtown were royalists and Robert was trying to get access to ships taken down to the Stormlands, and the Vale's kind of been split because Lord Orwyn's supporting Robert and protecting him, and others are saying, well, no, Aerys wants their heads. So Lyn Corbray won his spurs for fighting there, and at the Trident, now we're fighting all together with Robert, and his father's been wounded, and he takes up his father's sword, this Valyrian steel sword named Lady Forlorn, and he leads a charge, a counter charge, which ends up breaking the Dornish lines, and he apparently kills Lewin. It's said later, of course, and obviously he makes much of the fact that he killed the famous Lewin Martell, Prince Lewin of Dorne. He makes much of it. Littlefinger, who's telling us this little bit of detail in later books, says, of course, they say Lewin was already injured from half a dozen wounds, but you don't tell that to Corbray, that you don't tell that to his face that you killed him just because he was practically dead anyways. But 3 of the Kingsguard aren't around, and that would be Went and Hightower and Dayne. Their whereabouts are a little strange. We don't know for a fact, for example, that Went and Dayne were ever at King's Landing when the whole thing came out with Rickard and Brandon Stark. They may have been gone. We don't know this for a fact, but I suspect it likely. I suspect likely this is because they were accompanying Rhaegar on the various things he was doing. Hightower, we know. As I said, he was there and he took Jaime aside. But at some point, he leaves. And he ends up at the Tower of Joy with his Silver Brothers. I've got theories about this. Which is namely that my own theory, and this is absolutely a theory, I don't have special knowledge, is that Lyanna Stark, who Rhaegar seizes or runs away with or what have you, no one knows exactly yet, or no one says exactly, in a reliable way. I think she stayed on at Harrenhal. She was present with her brothers at Harrenhal. I think she stayed after her brothers went on and they were getting ready to come back to the Riverlands anyways, because Brandon was going to get married to Catelyn. And I think she's there at Harrenhal when Rhaegar comes along and absconds with her. And I think Went and Dayne were with him. Now, it gets all very murky. Did he go to King's Landing with her and his Kingsguard? Did he go somewhere else? Did he go straight to his Tower of Joy, which was apparently his favorite place in in the world. This remote tower in sort of the Dornish Marches, or right in the Red Mountains. Gerald Hightower, I think, was probably dispatched to wherever Rhaegar was to tell him, your father commands that you need to lead the armies to defend us. And so he gets there. Clearly Rhaegar does. We hear he came back from the south to take command of the armies. And then there's all sorts of questions, of course. Why were they there? I'm not going to get into all that. You have your theories. But at the end of the war, everything's done, and Ned comes to the Tower of Joy. And it's probably because Lyanna is there. That he, in his dream, he remembers her screaming, and he's holding her in his arms because she's died of illness, he says. And he tears down the tower and he uses it to build the cairns that he'll have to make, because he goes there with just his 6 friends, 7 men in total, and there's the 3 Kingsguard, and it's a beautiful passage. It's poetic, where Ned says, I looked for you on the Trident, but you were not there, and I fought you when we'd be on Dragonstone when Sir William Dari took the Queen and the Prince, and he's a good man and true, but not of a Kingsguard. The Kingsguard does not flee. These lines are sort of burned in my memory. It's such a beautiful passage, and there's a sadness. I mean, so Arthur Dane, and so it begins, and he's smiling sadly, and Ned says, no, now it ends, and then it's 7 men, him and his companions, against these 3 Kingsguard, including the old Sir Gerald Hightower, and I'm pretty sure Went was not the youngest either, but then it's, at the end of it, the 3 Kingsguard are dead, and they took 5 men with them, and Ned almost died. And it's just Ned and Howland Reed who survive. And epic. And there's so much mystery and so much sadness and tragedy surrounding this. To me, it's a central moment of what the story is about, and it's one of the things that I regret most that the TV series doesn't really touch on. It's very rich. So, Dane, of course, and I mean the other thing, of course, is Dane's sword. I mean, after his death, Ned takes Dawn, and now Dawn is. There's this whole thing about the Sword of the Morning. It's not a by name. It's not like the Hound or the Mountain of Rise, some nickname people give somebody for being a badass, for being a great warrior. It's an office. It's an office that the Danes passed down through centuries, through millennia. I mean, the Danes claim that they've been around in Westeros since the dawn of days. For 10,000 years, Danes and Oakhearts allegedly have been killing one another. So we're a descendant of the first men. And Dawn may not be 10,000 years old, but George has said, when he's asked, how old is Dawn? Because it's not Valyrian steel as we understand it. Valyrian steel is always black and smoky. Dawn, on the other hand, is pale as milk glass. It's very pale. It's very different, and yet it's clearly on the same level, at least, of Valyrian steel being super sharp, light and super sharp, and sort of it basically never goes dull. And George said, well, it's at least 1,000 or 2,000 years old, and beyond that it gets kind of misty because legends and such, and I have my theories about what that means. But the Sword of the Morning appears to be the office that we've heard at least of one other Sword of the Morning, Sir Ulrich Dane, perhaps in the reign of Daeron the Good, somewhere around there. We don't know exactly. It's an office, and George says, but the Danes, essentially it's the office given to a Dane who is somehow considered to merit carrying Dawn. It's a very strange thing. I mean, most lords, Dawn, a weapon like Dawn, and this heirloom weapon, this valuable, rare, one-of-a-kind thing, the lord carries it. Funnily enough, Lyn Corbray is an exception to that. His father actually leaves it to him in his will, which is a bit of an annoyance for his brother, but it's sort of, thanking him for saving his life and so on. And presumably when Corbray dies, the sword goes back into the family, but in general, it's the lord that has it. But here, the Danes do this very different thing. They wait for someone who's worthy, and it's not like Lord Dane calls himself Sword of the Morning and takes it whenever he wants. It's a strong tradition. So where's Dawn at the present period? It's at Starfall, George says, waiting for a new sword of the morning to arise to carry it. Fascinating stuff. I really hope we someday learn a bit more about the mysteries and secrets of that family and the sword. As I said, I have theories, but it's a bit distracting to get into that. So the Kingsguard have pretty much been wiped out at the end of Robert's Rebellion. And they were some of the greatest knights of her day. And what follows after, as I said when I discussed the Barristan thing, is because Jaime killed the king. As far as we know, he's the first Kingsguard to ever do that. There is this whole thing about Maegor the Cruel being killed by the Iron Throne, and I kind of suspect that maybe that's a way around the fact that some of his own Kingsguard said enough and killed him. We might learn a little bit more about that for the World of Ice and Fire. But because of that, and because suddenly he had to replace 5 white swords, the men who followed were much lesser. We have a conversation in the books in which Dead protests, well, the Kingsguard will protect the king, and he said, which of them, the Mirren Trant and Boros Blount are the Queen's creatures? I have deep suspicions about, the rest. Which is a little unfair. Aerys Oakheart actually isn't. He's weak. He's a weak man. But he strives for that ideal, even as he fails. Barristan Selmy is the only one who's a true steel. The kinds, in Aemon the Dragon Knight and Ryan Redwine and Sir Arthur Dayne the Sword of Morning wore the white cloak. He's the only one who has that true steel, but he's old. He's old. You can't expect him to do it all. So it's lesson. It's a fallen thing. And this is, if you're just here because you just watched the show and you haven't read the books. I mean, you might want to step off here because the next is some spoilery material, but developments in Storm of Swords. So okay, Storm of Swords, you know that at the end of Game of Thrones, Jaime was made Lord Commander, but of course he's a prisoner. Storm of Swords, he eventually finds his way back to King's Landing, and he refuses, his father's overtures to give up the White Cloak and go back to being his heir. He insists, I'm Lord Commander, that's all I want to be. And it's interesting to me that Jaime, in his renewed sort of belief in honor and an attempt to be more honorable, more as he should have been, because as he said, somewhere along the way, the boy who wanted to be the Sword of the Morning became the Smiling Knight, and he wanted to move back from that. And it's interesting to me that Jaime, one of the things he does is when he meets with his sworn brothers and learns about, talks about the fact that I've heard that you were beating Sansa Stark and things like that, and it was it the King's command? And Jaime says a very, very interesting thing is that you're there to protect him. Yes, you do what he says, but if he tells you to do something that seems really wrong, like beating an innocent girl, or if Tommen tells you to, and yes, this is after Joffrey's dead. If Tommen tells you to saddle his horse, go ahead and do it. If he tells you, go and kill my horse, come to me first. Jaime seems to be changing the understanding of the vows to fall in line with his whole thing about how the vows all seem to conflict. Well, they don't conflict if you think them through properly. I mean, when you have to, you're there to defend the king, but sometimes that can mean you're defending him from himself. The king is trying to kill himself. You might want to stop him. If you think he's not in a state to make that decision rationally, you'd stop him, right? When the king is saying, I'm going to roast the whole city with wildfire, let Robert be king over bones and ashes, and I'll probably come back a dragon. Well, that all that fire he's mad, he's crazy, he's not competent he's killing himself. I keep thinking that Jaime probably should have made the decision of stopping Aerys and maybe trying to get away with him. It would have failed, probably. He might have died. But if he had done that, the Kingsguard would have been almost certainly a very different institution by the time we get to A Game of Thrones. Dany might be dead, but Barristan would be there, and he would still have pride in it. And the men who follow would not have to go, oh, I have a stain of, this cloak is stained because of the Kingslayer still being here and what he did. I don't have to care. I don't have to act, comport myself properly. Maybe the men wouldn't have become Cersei's creatures. Maybe the men who were the Kingsguard in this day and age would not have gone around beating Sansa whenever Joffrey said. They might not have stopped him, in other words, from being king and doing other terrible things. But they might not have been debased themselves and their institution and their vows. There's hope. The Kingsguard now, more or less, has some really decent seeming guys in it. Balon Swan, Loras Tyrell. Sir Robert Strong is not so much, but I think it's a very interesting. I had an interest in medieval history and sort of the chivalric culture and history, and I find that in this George really captures the realism of the fact that chivalry was this ideal that many paid lip service to, and some really did. The greatest knights in history were men who really believed in these things. Jack LaLange was perhaps the greatest knight of his day. Fought all these, melees and jousts and was exemplary. Killed by a cannonball, which I think is a great statement as to the end of chivalry. I believe that Lord Rivers, or was it Lord Scales, allegedly had a hair shirt when he was killed. They were stripping his body. He was wearing a hair shirt. It was sort of an act of penance. He really believed in his God and his calling. So, and at the same time, so many of them fail at it because they're not perfect. The whole point of an ideal is something to strive for. To try and do your best to be the best. And if you don't, and that's what the Kingsguard were. They were this symbol for everyone. They were this. Well, funnily enough, the men who were the first Kingsguard were maybe not quite what you would expect, but that's for the World of Ice and Fire to reveal more about. And on that note, I think I'll wrap this up. This turned out to be much longer than I expected it to be.